Imagine a war where nobody officially declares war, a conflict where the world's most powerful empires secretly plot an invasion only to be brought to their knees, not on the battlefield, but in the currency markets and at the United Nations. That was the Suez Crisis of 1956. In just a few weeks, Britain, France, Israel, Egypt, the United States, and the Soviet Union collided over a narrow strip of water, the Suez Canal. Ships kept moving, but the balance of global power did not. This is the story of how a canal built in the 19th century shattered 19th century empires, elevated new superpowers, and rewrote the rules of international politics. It's a war of backroom deals, secret protocols, and public humiliation. Stay with this video, because by the end, you'll see why a short conflict in 1956 still shapes energy politics, the Middle East, and the limits of military power today. In this video, we're unpacking the Suez Crisis, what happened, why it exploded in 1956, and how it quietly reset who truly runs the world. We'll move step by step, from the canal's creation to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's bold gamble, to the secret meetings where Britain, France, and Israel drew up invasion plans they thought no one would ever uncover. We'll look at how Washington and Moscow turned a regional clash into a global standoff, why financial pressure mattered more than tanks, and how the crisis signaled the end of European empires. If you enjoy clear, story-driven history that connects past events to today's world, this is your place. Consider subscribing and tapping the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming deep dives. And watch through to the end. We'll finish with the key lessons modern leaders, investors, and ordinary citizens should take from Suez in an age of new great power rivalries. To understand why Suez mattered, we have to start with the canal itself. Completed in 1869, the Suez Canal carved a shortcut between Europe and Asia, slashing thousands of miles off voyages around Africa. It became the central artery of global trade, especially for oil. By the 1950s, roughly two-thirds of Western Europe's oil imports flowed through this narrow waterway in Egypt. Control of Suez meant leverage over energy, shipping costs, and wartime logistics. That's why Britain made it a cornerstone of its empire, operating bases along the canal and holding a major stake in the Suez Canal Company. Yet the canal physically sat inside a proudly independent post-colonial Egypt. This mismatch, European control over a supposedly sovereign country's most strategic asset, was a time bomb. As world politics shifted after World War II, Suez stopped being just an engineering marvel and became a symbol of who actually owned the 20th century. Egypt in the early 1950s was not the passive colony it had once been. In 1952, a group of young military officers overthrew King Farouk in a coup, railing against corruption, inequality, and foreign domination. Among them was a charismatic colonel, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser embodied a new wave of Arab nationalism. He wanted Egypt to be independent not only on paper, but in reality, free of British troops, free of European economic control, and free to lead the Arab world. He navigated a delicate Cold War landscape, playing the US and USSR off each other to secure arms and infrastructure deals. To many in the Arab street, he became a symbol of dignity after decades of humiliation. But to London and Paris, Nasser looked dangerously defiant. A leader who challenged Western oil interests, supported anti-colonial movements, and refused to be quietly aligned in the Western Bloc. Conflict over Suez grew steadily more likely. The spark finally came in July 1956. Earlier that year, the United States and Britain abruptly withdrew funding for Nasser's dream project, the Aswan High Dam on the Nile, after he bought arms from Czechoslovakia, aligning more closely with the Soviet bloc. Nasser needed money, and he wanted to strike back. On July 26th, during a speech in Alexandria, he stunned the world. He announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. Egypt would take full control. Canal revenues would fund the Aswan Dam. Crowds erupted in celebration. In Cairo, Egyptian forces peacefully seized the company's offices. For Egyptians and many in the global south, it was a proud reclamation of sovereignty. In London and Paris, fury. To them, this was theft of a vital strategic asset and a dangerous precedent for other colonies. Britain's Prime Minister Anthony Eden compared Nasser to Hitler. Instead of accepting a new reality, Britain and France began plotting to reverse it, by force. Publicly, Britain and France talked of defending international rights of navigation. Privately, they wanted Nasser removed. But both powers had a problem. Marching directly into Egypt risked global backlash and might provoke the Soviet Union. Enter Israel. Since its creation in 1948, Israel had clashed with Egypt over borders, Fedayeen raids, and Nasser's closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Israel saw Nasser as an existential threat. In October 1956, British, French, and Israeli officials met secretly in Sèvres outside Paris. There, they drafted a plan so covert it was later denied for years. Israel would invade Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to separate the combatants and protect the Canal. When Egypt inevitably refused, Anglo-French forces would attack, seize the Canal zone, and ideally topple Nasser. This collusion, Operation Musketeer, was meant to disguise regime change as peacekeeping. On October 29, 1956, the plan moved from paper to reality. Israeli paratroopers dropped deep into the Sinai, racing toward the canal while ground forces swept across the desert. Egypt, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. 2 days later, Britain and France issued their scripted ultimatum to both sides: stop fighting and withdraw from the Canal Zone, or face military action. They knew Egypt would reject it. Israel was in on the scheme. When Nasser refused, Anglo-French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields, and naval forces prepared to land troops along the canal. On paper, the military operation was well within Western capabilities. Egypt's forces were outmatched in the air and at sea. But from the beginning, something was off. Radio broadcasts and global press coverage highlighted the obvious. The sequencing of events looked far too convenient. Many suspected collusion. The battle for Egypt was turning into a battle for world opinion. The Suez intervention unfolded just as the Cold War reached a new crisis point. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union was brutally crushing the Hungarian uprising, drawing worldwide condemnation. Now, suddenly, Western powers were invading Egypt. For Washington, this was a nightmare. President Dwight Eisenhower had not been told of the Sèvres plot. The US feared that open colonial-style aggression in Egypt would push Arab states toward the Soviet camp and undermine American claims to support self-determination. The Soviet Union, eager to divert attention from Hungary and gain influence in the Arab world, denounced the invasion and threatened vague rocket attacks on London and Paris. Caught between allies and principles, the US chose pressure over partnership. Eisenhower made it clear he would not back Britain and France. Without the American security guarantee, their gamble began to look dangerously exposed, not on the battlefield, but in the realm of finance and diplomacy. As bombs fell on Egypt, the real turning point happened in banks and currency markets. Britain in 1956 was still a major power, but its economy was fragile and heavily dependent on US support. The pound sterling relied on American confidence and access to International Monetary Fund loans. Eisenhower and his Treasury Secretary quietly wielded a devastating weapon: financial pressure. The US signaled it might refuse emergency aid and even sell sterling reserves, risking a currency collapse. Without dollars, Britain could not sustain a long war, maintain global commitments, and protect its currency simultaneously. At the same time, the UN General Assembly, bypassing a deadlocked Security Council, condemned the invasion and demanded a ceasefire. International opinion tilted sharply against the tripartite attackers. Facing a run on sterling diplomatic isolation and US anger, Prime Minister Eden realized Britain could not continue. Military success on the ground was being erased by strategic defeat in the markets. Under mounting pressure, events moved quickly. Israeli forces had advanced deep into Sinai. British and French paratroopers seized key points along the Canal, and their naval task force dominated the eastern Mediterranean. Militarily, they could have gone further, but on November 6, 1956, just as their troops were gaining ground, London announced a ceasefire. Paris, furious but dependent on Britain, followed. Israel would later agree to withdraw from Sinai under US and UN pressure. The United Nations created its first large-scale peacekeeping force, the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, to supervise withdrawals and patrol the Egypt-Israel border. It was a new model, blue-helmeted troops separating former combatants, attempting to stabilize a ceasefire without fully resolving underlying disputes. On paper, Egypt had suffered bombings and a military setback, yet Nasser remained in power, the Canal stayed nationalized, and the colonial powers were the ones backing away. Symbolically, Egypt emerged stronger. The immediate military outcome masked the deeper shift. For Britain and France, Suez was a humiliation that exposed the limits of their power. They had planned a swift, decisive operation to topple Nasser and reassert control over global choke points. Instead, they were forced to retreat, not by Egyptian arms, but by American and international pressure. In London, Prime Minister Anthony Eden's reputation collapsed. Seen as reckless and dishonest, he resigned within months. Suez shattered the illusion that Britain remained a truly independent global policeman. France, though equally angered, drew different conclusions. Convinced it could no longer rely on Anglo-American support, it doubled down on developing its own nuclear deterrent and pursued a more independent foreign policy. Both powers increasingly accepted that leadership of the West now belonged to Washington. Suez didn't just end an operation. It signaled that the age of traditional European empire was effectively over. For Egypt and the Arab world, Suez carried enormous symbolic weight. Nasser, who had technically lost ground in Sinai, could present himself as the man who stood up to three powerful states and survived. In much of the global south, he became a hero of anti-colonial resistance. The crisis accelerated decolonization. Leaders from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East saw that European empires could be forced to back down with enough international and domestic pressure. Suez also strengthened the non-aligned movement, states trying to chart a path between Washington and Moscow. At the same time, deeper tensions hardened. Israel resented being pressured into withdrawal after military gains. Arab states drew closer to the Soviet Union for arms and diplomatic backing. Suez didn't resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, it pushed it into a more Cold War-infused phase. The canal itself soon reopened under Egyptian control, but the region around it remained ideologically and strategically contested. Beyond the Middle East, Suez rewrote global power structures. It confirmed what World War II had already suggested. The world was now bipolar. Real authority rested with the United States and the Soviet Union, both nuclear-armed superpowers capable of influencing regional conflicts without direct occupation. For Washington, Suez was a lesson in the costs of colonial optics. Even when goals aligned with European allies, openly backing an imperial-style intervention risked driving newly independent nations into Moscow's arms. The US would instead develop subtler tools, coups, covert action, economic leverage, and alliances framed as partnerships. For Moscow, the crisis showed the power of rhetoric and limited threats to expand influence without massive deployments. Soviet leaders didn't fire missiles at London or Paris, but simply suggesting they might gain attention and prestige. Suez also elevated international institutions. The UN's role in organizing peacekeepers and channeling diplomatic outrage became a template for later crises. When we compress the Suez Crisis into a headline, we miss its layered lessons. First, it proves that military strength alone doesn't guarantee victory. Britain, France, and Israel achieved tactical success but lost strategically to financial pressure, global opinion, and US opposition. Second, Suez marks the definitive passing of the torch from European empires to superpower dominance. After 1956, London and Paris had to operate within a world largely shaped by Washington and Moscow. Third, it highlights how symbols matter. A canal was more than water and ships. It stood for sovereignty, pride, and the right of new nations to control their resources. Finally, Suez is a warning about misreading the moment. Eden and his allies fought the last war, using colonial-era thinking in a post-colonial world. Nasser, in contrast, understood the power of nationalism and media. In today's disputes over straits, pipelines, and resources, these dynamics haven't disappeared, they've just evolved. If you've reached this point, you now know why a brief conflict in 1956 still shapes the world we live in, from energy security and shipping routes to US influence in the Middle East and the role of international institutions. To recap in one line, the Suez Crisis was the moment when old empires discovered that guns and ships were no longer enough, and that finance, diplomacy, and public opinion could decide wars. If you found this breakdown useful, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. We dive into turning points like this all the time, moments where the map of power quietly changes. Drop a comment with another Cold War or decolonization crisis you'd like to see covered. Maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Algerian War, or the fall of the Shah in Iran. And if you know someone studying history or international relations, share this video with them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.